Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard Gaming. I've got another 11 facts video for you today. This time it's on the original Sony PlayStation. And this one will be a pretty interesting 11 facts video, I think, for a few reasons. First of all, let me tell you that I was a bit resistant to the PlayStation when it was new. It took me a while to come around, but eventually I did, and I owned one in its prime. Well, really more like 2 or 3, but that's besides the point. Why was I so hesitant at first? Well, I was a huge fan of Sega at that point, but I'd got the Saturn almost right away, and I didn't want this mega-rich interloper and Sony crushing both Sega and Nintendo, the real game companies in the business. But what can I say? Things happen. Just like I appreciated Nintendo and Sega both at the same time, I began to appreciate what Sony was offering in the games market, even if I hated some of their tactics like buying big exclusives, something that ironically, Sony was just sort of complaining about Microsoft doing very recently.
Shut up and get to the point!
Right you are, Bender. Let's move on. Join me now for a look at 11 facts about the Sony PlayStation that you maybe didn't know. Let's get on with it. The PlayStation concept originally started life as an add-on for the Super Famicom/Super Nintendo. Let's start with an easy one, because this video is for longtime PlayStation fans and new retro gaming fans alike. Now, Sony was originally working with Nintendo during the era of the Super Famicom/SNES to develop a CD add-on which would have been named, you guessed it, the PlayStation. Sony had developed prototypes and everything. You've probably seen them online by now, but if not, here you go. So what exactly happened? Well, Nintendo didn't like the amount of control and apparently fees that Sony was demanding for the PlayStation. Eventually, Nintendo very publicly and shockingly dumped Sony with an announcement that they were going to go with Philips at the June 1991 Consumer Electronics Show. How surprised was Sony? They had PlayStation units at that very Consumer Electronics Show. And it was this embarrassment that led Sony to eventually developing the PlayStation into a new standalone hardware device that they would release in Japan in December of 1994, and then nearly a year later in the US in September of 1995. Things ended up working out okay for Sony. The PlayStation was the first home console to sell over 100 million units. To say the PlayStation changed everything when it launched in 1995 here in the US would be an understatement. Who could have imagined that when Nintendo shunned Sony, possibly for good reason as noted a few moments ago, it would lead to a new industry juggernaut that took gaming into uncharted territory when it came to popularity? Sony managed to secure a lot of big games for the PlayStation that helped catapult it to success. Getting big Psygnosis games like Wipeout helped early on, and eventually absorbing that company helped even more. Securing Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, well, those are huge boons for the system in Japan, and they helped popularize the RPG genre in the West when it was mostly a niche market here during the 8 and 16-bit console eras. Being the prime platform for stuff like Metal Gear and Resident Evil all helped ensure that Sony had something for pretty much any gamer at that time. I mean, if you couldn't find some game that you liked on the PlayStation, you really just weren't trying. Now, I will put a little asterisk next to this fact. You'll notice I said home console in the title because Nintendo did sell over 100 million Game Boys if we count the original Game Boy, Game Boy Pocket, Game Boy Color, and any other Game Boy systems that were derived from the original 8-bit Game Boy hardware. The PlayStation was powered by a MIPS R3000A CPU. During the 8 and 16-bit console generations, CPUs were traditionally purchased from a company like Zilog or Motorola for each unit manufactured, and in most cases were subject to some, but not much, customization. Traditional CPUs like the MOS 6502, Zilog Z80, and Motorola 68000, to name a few, were CISC, or complex instruction set computers that held lots of commands and registers and could do things like combine memory access with register operations. Now, I've talked about RISC, or reduced instruction set computer chips, in a few of these videos in the past. RISC chips simplified the operations a chip could perform and increased their efficiency and in some cases their practical speed. And don't worry, that's gonna do it for most of the complicated tech mumbo jumbo here. By the time Sony was designing the standalone PlayStation, processors for MIPS or MIPS, the company, had found their way into Silicon Graphics computer workstations and would eventually handle duties for tasks like rendering the amazing, for the time, special effects in movies like Jurassic Park in 1993. Sony decided to go with a MIPS R3000A design. And why do I say they went with a design? Because at that point, MIPS licensed their chip designs to companies who were making the things, and they were free to manufacture them to the original spec from MIPS or make any changes that they wanted. Sony chose to go with a lower-end chipset for the PlayStation to save on cost. Eventually, Nintendo would go with a MIPS 4000 variant for the Nintendo 64. Sony would go on to create the CXD 8530, which was based on the R1003A, which happened to be very similar to the CW 33000 from LSI. Well, that's a lot of abbreviations and numbers, huh? Anyway, despite the fact that this chip was not one of the top-of-the-line ones used in the SGI devices, which would have made the PlayStation unaffordable back in 1995, the CPU Sony had gone with was still way more powerful than anything in the 16-bit systems of the time. I don't think anyone could argue that it wasn't powerful enough to help change the entire landscape of gaming from primarily 2D to primarily 3D for years to come. You might consider that last part either a positive or negative depending on your point of view. A bunch of early units had hardware problems with sometimes unique solutions. So you're a PlayStation gamer back in 1996 who's had your console since launch. You've probably noticed at this point that cutscenes in a bunch of games are starting to skip, and it's happening more and more often, maybe all the time. What could you possibly do to fix this problem? You might just think that the disc is dirty. If you think that,
well, you're wrong!
You check that disc and it's clean. You wipe it down a few more times just in case, and no dice, the skipping keeps happening. So what could you possibly do to make it work? Well, how about you flip that PlayStation upside down? Believe it or not, that was the actual answer for a lot of PlayStation users who bought units in the first few years of the system's lifetime. It almost became as common a solution as blowing into NES cartridges when that system wouldn't read those. Now the good news is that Sony updated the design of the PlayStation several times, and after a few years, they placed higher quality lasers into the systems, and those skipping issues were finally resolved without having to degrade your PlayStation by shamefully making it stick its butt into the air. The PlayStation controller went through several revisions before the final unit. Yeah, I know every device ever designed went through a bunch of revisions before it reached its final unit. But still, look at this thing. This is the original controller that Sony shipped with the PlayStation. When it was first shown in magazines, lots of people back then couldn't help but notice the similarity in layout to the SNES controller, betraying the PlayStation's roots a bit. But things could have ended up quite a bit differently. Take a look at these controller designs. And while it's easy to look at these and dismiss them now, I actually would like to have seen some of the elements employed in a few of these prototypes integrated into the final design. And while I like and sometimes even prefer having 6 face buttons, I'm really not thrilled with the arrangements here. The angles look a little weird, but something that I do like is the Sega-style D-pad here, where we have what looks like a floating disc with sort of a directional cross or directional button sticking out of the top of it. I've never been a fan of the broken up D-pad that the original PlayStation and several generations afterwards employed, particularly the versions of these controllers that were with the first 3 PlayStation systems. I would have vastly preferred the D-pad used on some of these guys. Or girls. I don't know what they are, okay? Anyway, this 4-button job here has weird shapes that make it look kind of like a walrus face. It's hard to picture using this thing with these button shapes and positions and, imagine that they would be comfortable or natural. I'm definitely glad this design was tossed out. I do find this one kind of interesting though. So they were thinking about going with 3 main action buttons and then something that looks almost like the start button on some old arcade games above those action buttons. The shape of the controller is very Genesis/Mega Drive-like overall, and I don't think I would have really liked the button placement, but I'm still curious how games might have come together if this thing had been the standard design. Anyway, years later, Sony finally tweaked the controller by the time the PlayStation 4 came around with the DualShock 4 and created one of the most comfortable controllers ever in the DualSense for the PS5. But they stuck with that original general PS1 design and shape for almost 20 years before changing. There were many changes to the original PlayStation model. Now, I alluded to this before, and it's not exactly news that hardware manufacturers revise models of consoles. It happens all the time. Even back then, we saw it with the Genesis, Genesis 2, and Genesis 3, for example. And in between, there were some very minor internal revisions to the system. And then we also had 2 entirely different versions of other systems like the NES, Sega Master System, and even the Super Nintendo. However, Sony did go a little crazy with the whole revision thing. Before there were any major design revisions like the PS1, it had 4 different models, and some of them even had entirely different ports. And some of these models had sub-models with other minor differences, but there were 4 primary ones. And here are 4 different versions of the PlayStation that have the major revisions, so you can see the differences here. The original release on the bottom has the most ports with a parallel I/O port, a serial I/O port, standard RCA jack AV connectors, an S-video connector, and the multi-AV out connector. The next revision was almost identical, but remove the S-Video port, and then the next major revision removed all the RCA jacks. And then finally, the parallel I/O port was also removed. Now personally, I feel every game system of this era should have had an S-Video port, as it provided the clearest signal you could get on a standard TV. But at least there were some S-Video cables made that used the multi-out on the back of the PlayStation that all of the units had. And by the time the PlayStation had come out in 1995, S-Video ports were already starting to become pretty common on higher-end and larger model TVs at the time. Larger model TVs back then having been about 32 to 36-inch CRTs. And of course, there was one more major revision of the PlayStation all the way in July of 2000. Sony released its itsy-bitsy little PS1, ONE, perhaps slightly inspired just a tinge by the size and shape of the Sega Dreamcast. This one was also famous for having that official Sony LCD screen attachment. All in all, there are 30 distinct revisions of the original PlayStation hardware. There are about 4,074 official games for the PlayStation. One of the things I really like to cover in these videos is just how many games were officially released for each platform that I discuss. Sometimes that section is almost comically small for systems like the Jaguar. Then you have other systems like the PlayStation here, where the number is huge. According to multiple sources and lists of each game individually, there are 4,074 official games that found their way to Sony's original PlayStation console. Now I have to admit, I'm a little bit surprised that the number isn't even higher than this, but that's still about 4 times the amount of games that were released for its direct competitor, the Sega Saturn. If you want to hear all about the Saturn and some weird facts about it and its hardware and games, check out my 11 facts about the Sega Saturn that you maybe didn't know. Anyway, back to the business at hand. Sony sure brought in a lot of big hits and franchises with exclusivity deals back in the day, as I talked about a little bit earlier. But just to make things a little bit simpler and catalog a bunch of them here, the PlayStation had a ton of big games, many of which were exclusive, some of which weren't. But we had games like Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9, Final Fantasy Tactics, Tekken and Ridge Racer games, which were all only on PlayStation. We had Metal Gear Solid, which was only on the PlayStation at the time, Gran Turismo 1 and 2, the Crash Bandicoot games, the Spyro the Dragon games, Dragon Quest VII, Silent Hill, Tomb Raider 2, Tomb Raider 3, and so many more. There were plenty of other weird and esoteric games out there too. So also, like I said before, if you couldn't find anything you liked on the PlayStation, you really just weren't looking. Sony may have been just a bit inspired by the Dreamcast VMU with the release of the PocketStation. This is the PocketStation. You may or may not have seen it before. It's a visual memory card for the original PlayStation console that wasn't released until January of 1999, after the release of the Sega Dreamcast in Japan, which had come out in 1998. The PocketStation was originally supposed to come out in December, but it had been delayed by about a month. Still, the Dreamcast easily predated it. Now, the Dreamcast came with the VMU, or Visual Memory Unit, that looked like an itty-bitty Game Boy and could play super simple games when separated from the Dreamcast controller. Guess what you used the PocketStation for? I'm not being too hard on Sony here. Every game company in the hardware business has lifted something from its competitors at one point or another. But the PocketStation here was very clearly a response to Sega's VMU, which had launched with the Dreamcast in Japan the prior year. It was really popular, the PocketStation, when it came out in Japan, selling out immediately. Now, it worked as a memory card for all games, and then there were several PlayStation games that had special compatibility with special software for the PocketStation. And special thanks for Retro Gaming Addict for allowing me to use some of their PocketStation footage in this segment of the video. In all, depending on how you count them, there's either 86 or 87 games that offered specific PocketStation compatibility. Now, like the VMU, the games the PocketStation could play were incredibly simple, and I would say in most cases, not really worth your time. It would have been a neat little tech oddity or distraction back when it was new, and I don't know about you guys, but I feel like I was done using the Dreamcast VMU for gaming after like maybe a week or two. So the PocketStation support ended in 2002, and the little device had never been released outside of Japan. This is one case where I would say we really didn't miss too much. Sony tried to work with Sega on the PlayStation before going it alone. Or did they? After Sony had been very publicly jilted by Nintendo, Tom Kalinske, then president of Sega of America, had spoken with a few people involved with Sony's then fairly small game business. Kalinske has given several interviews on this topic. One of the more recent interviews he's done is with the site Time Extension that echoes some of what he's discussed in the past. Now, according to this interview and some others conducted with Kalinske, back in those days, Kalinske had a decent relationship with Olaf Olafsson and even Mickey Shuloff, who was the president of Sony of America at the time. Shuloff had said that Sony didn't like working with Nintendo which was understandable after the Nintendo PlayStation debacle, and that they wanted to work with Sega because they both knew that CD-ROM was the gaming format of the future. Together, they hashed out a plan where the companies would share in both the loss of hardware sales but the profit of software sales. They had a detailed plan that Sony agreed to in principle, according to Kalinske. Kalinske then took that plan to Sega's head honcho at the time, Hayao Nakayama, who had famously asked why should they go into business with Sony when Sony had no gaming hardware experience and barely any software experience. The execs at Sega of Japan immediately rejected the idea of teaming up with Sony. Kalinske would refer to this as the stupidest decision ever made in the history of business. But to be completely fair to Nakayama and Sega of Japan, who definitely made a lot of mistakes in those days, it would have been reasonable to ask what Sony would bring to the table. It was impossible to know the juggernaut that the PlayStation would become back then after lots of other big electronics companies had failed in the video game business. But here's the last thing on this. That isn't even the full story. Other people like Isao Okawa, the chairman of Sega back then, had meetings with Sony executives in Japan, like Sony president Norio Oga. There were some discussions with Ken Kutaragi as well. And from reports of those meetings, it doesn't seem like Sony really ever took the idea of working with Sega on hardware seriously, and may have been more pressing them for information to help get themselves started in the console business. Anyway, once again, we all know how this story ended up. The original PlayStation games in the US came in tall Sega CD and Saturn-like cases. Unless you're a crusty old gamer like me who was there back in 1995, you might not know that PlayStation games didn't ship originally in CD-style jewel cases. Nope, they came in these giant tall cases that were the same size as Sega CD and Saturn game cases. How do I know that? Well, we'll get to that in a second. There was a lot of empty space in those cases, but at least you got pretty large manuals. That's right, gamers. Back in the day, we used to actually get instructions that had things like screenshots and illustrations in them. Crazy, right? Want to know something even crazier? According to contemporary sources like Electronic Gaming Monthly, known better as EGM, Sony actually purchased those original game cases, the tall plastic ones, directly from Sega. This marked the first time that two competing game systems had identical cases, but it didn't last. Before long, Sony switched to long boxes that were a combination of plastic and cardboard for some releases, and then eventually made the wise decision to switch to normal CD-style jewel cases. While I think there was something to be said for the uniqueness of the larger game cases back then, these days I wish all companies that had been making disc-based games back in the day had gone with jewel cases in all regions. Some regions they did, but not here in the US. It would have kept everything, uniform and made storage and display a little simpler. And if that's not the poster child example of a first world problem, well, I don't know what is. The most valuable game for the PlayStation is currently a particular version of NFL Blitz 2000. As usual, I like to make the last fact in these videos about the currently most expensive game on record as I record the video. So as of early November 2025, that honor goes to a specific greatest hits version of NFL Blitz 2000. And you thought the greatest hits lineup was supposed to be cheap. This one, if you can find it brand new by chance, is worth about $13,650. Which in the current economy may cover perhaps a week's worth of groceries. No, I'm kidding. We all know it wouldn't be enough to cover that. But seriously, that's a lot of money for a greatest hits game, no less. This one is a rare variant with a specific UPC number, so don't start jumping for joy if you have this game in your collection just yet. You can check out my link to price charting, which has the UPC listed, so you can tell if you basically just hit the lottery or not. Now, a complete in-boxed used version of the game is sold for a mere pittance at $5,250, while all the plebs who could be satisfied with an almost worthless used loose disc, well, they only have to spend $3,028-ish. And when it comes to hardware, if you got yourself one of them Nintendo PlayStation prototypes from Sony, well, I don't know exactly what price charting is counting as new, complete, and loose, since it's not like these things were sold to the public in boxes, but that loose price of $360,000 can certainly pay a few bills. Alright, so there's my look at 11 facts for the original Sony PlayStation. This is another system that was so popular and had so many things available for it that I could easily do another 11 facts video, so if that's something you want to see in the future, let me know. Tell me in the comments. But that's all I have to say about the PlayStation for now. So tell me, what was your PlayStation experience like? What facts would you have chosen to cover here that I didn't? Did you learn anything new? Was there anything interesting that you'd never seen or heard before? Tell me all about it in the comments. And that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. friends. If you enjoyed it, please like and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you won't ever miss any of my videos. Oh, and one quick note, you might want to look at your managed subscriptions in YouTube, because it's turned off alerts for some channels, including mine, and I've had some people check and the alerts were off even though they used to be on. So you might want to look at that. Anyway, you can support the work I do here on Patreon, Ko-fi, and right here on YouTube through things like super thanks and channel memberships. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.